I just wanted a quiet moment and a hot black coffee after the toughest case of my life. Instead, a petty officer's act of aggression revealed a darkness far deeper than I could have imagined. The rain was coming down in sheets, one of those miserable, bone-chilling drizzles that feels more like a personal insult from the sky than actual weather. It had been a long 72 hours. We'd just closed a particularly nasty human trafficking case that had taken me and my team across 3 states, and I was running on fumes, stale donuts, and the grim satisfaction of putting 3 monsters behind bars for the rest of their natural lives. All I wanted was a hot black coffee and an hour of silence before the long drive back to the field office. I found a small independent coffee shop called The Daily Grind in a sleepy little town named Maple Creek. It was the kind of place that prided itself on its rustic charm, exposed brick, mismatched wooden chairs, and the overwhelming scent of cinnamon and roasted beans. It was perfect, anonymous, quiet. I pulled the hood of my gray sweatshirt further over my head, a reflexive habit from years of undercover work, and joined the short line. There were only 2 people ahead of me, a college-age girl scrolling through her phone and a local cop. He was a cliché brought to life, a thick neck that strained the collar of his uniform, a paunch that pushed against his duty belt, and a self-important swagger that seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. He was chatting loudly with the young barista, a girl who couldn't have been more than 19, whose polite smiles were starting to look a little strained. And I told him, "You can either move the car, or I can move it for you," the officer boomed, punctuating the sentence with a laugh that was more of a bark. He moved it. The girl, whose name tag read Chloe, forced a giggle. "Wow, Officer Miller, you sure showed him." I just kept my eyes down, focusing on the scuffed toes of my sneakers. I wasn't looking for trouble. In my line of work, you learn to be a ghost on your days off. You blend in, you observe, you don't engage. The last thing I needed was any kind of local law enforcement attention. The college girl got her latte and left, and it was my turn. I stepped forward, ready to give my simple order. But Officer Miller didn't move. He just leaned against the counter, continuing his one-man show for Chloe. "Excuse me," I said, my voice low and quiet. I just wanted my coffee. Miller turned his head slowly, deliberately, and looked me up and down. His eyes, small and hard, took in my tired face, my dark skin, my plain hoodie and jeans. I saw a switch flip behind them. The jovial, loudmouth town hero was gone. In his place was something else, something cold and suspicious. "You in a hurry, buddy?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "No, sir," I said, keeping my tone even. "Just want to order." He smirked, a nasty little curl of his lip. "Well, I'm not done here. The line starts behind me." He gestured vaguely over his shoulder, even though there was no one else there. It was a power play, plain and simple. He was marking his territory. I felt a familiar exhaustion settle over me. It wasn't just the lack of sleep. It was this petty, pointless dance of dominance that I'd had to navigate my entire life. I could have just stepped back. Let him finish his story. Let him feel like the king of his little coffee-scented castle. But 72 hours of dealing with the absolute worst of humanity had left my patience worn down to a single, fraying thread. "With all due respect, officer," I said, my voice still quiet, but with a new edge of firmness. I was next. "I'm not trying to cause a problem. I'd just like to get my coffee." The air in the shop grew thick. Chloe's eyes widened, and she started nervously wiping down an already spotless counter. Miller's smirk vanished completely. He pushed himself off the counter and took a half-step toward me, invading my personal space. The smell of cheap aftershave and authority filled my nostrils. "You got a problem with the way I do things," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. He was trying to intimidate me, trying to see if I'd flinch. I didn't. I held his gaze. "My only problem is that I'm tired and I want a large black coffee. That's it." For a moment we were locked in a stalemate. His face was getting redder, his jaw clenching. He saw a challenge where I was just offering a simple fact. He saw a threat where I was just a tired man who wanted caffeine. He saw my skin, my hoodie, and his mind filled in a narrative that had nothing to do with reality. He glanced down at the fresh, steaming cup of coffee he was holding, then back up at me. A wicked gleam entered his eyes. "You know what? You look like you need to wake up." And then he moved. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a stumble. He deliberately, contemptuously, flung the entire contents of his large coffee directly onto my chest. The heat was a shocking, searing agony. The dark liquid instantly soaked through my hoodie and t-shirt, scalding my skin. A collective gasp came from the few other patrons in the shop. Chloe's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. I just stood there, stunned into silence, the smell of burnt coffee and sugar filling the air as hot liquid dripped from my clothes onto the floor. Miller took a step back, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He'd won. He'd put the problem back in his place. "Oops," he said, the word dripping with fake sincerity. "Clumsy me." He then leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for me. "Now get the hell out of my town before I decide to run your plates and find a real reason to arrest you." He thought it was over. He thought he had asserted his dominance, humiliated me, and would now watch me slink away with my tail between my legs. He saw the dark, spreading stain on my gray hoodie. He saw the stunned look on my face. What he didn't see was the shift happening inside me. The initial shock was fading. The pain was becoming a dull, distant throb. It was being replaced by something else, a cold, quiet rage, the kind of focused calm that had kept me alive in situations 1,000 times more dangerous than this little coffee shop. He had no idea that the man he'd just assaulted wasn't just some guy in a hoodie. He had no idea that my hand, which was now slowly, deliberately reaching inside my jacket, wasn't reaching for a cell phone to record him, or a wallet to appease him. It was closing around the cold, hard leather of my credentials and the heavy, metallic weight of my federal badge. My hand moved with a fluid calm that belied the fire spreading across my skin. I didn't wince, I didn't grimace, I just held Officer Miller's gaze as my fingers slid past the butt of my Sig Sauer and closed around my credentials. I pulled the leather wallet out slowly, deliberately, letting the moment stretch, letting his smug satisfaction curdle into confusion. I flipped it open. The golden seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation gleamed under the coffee shop's soft lighting, a stark contrast to the dark, spreading stain on my chest. My photograph stared out from the ID card, clear and official, next to the words, "Special Agent Marcus Thorne." I watched his face. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The ruddy color drained away, leaving a pasty, sickly pallor. His jaw went slack, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. The small, hard eyes that had been filled with such arrogance a moment before were now wide with pure, undiluted panic. He wasn't looking at a problem anymore. He was looking at a career-ending, life-altering mistake. "Special Agent Marcus Thorne," I said, my voice no longer quiet, but ringing with an authority that cut through the shocked silence of the room. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." A phone clattered to the floor somewhere behind me. Chloe the barista looked like she'd seen a ghost. Officer Miller took a clumsy step back, his hands coming up in a placating gesture. "Whoa, whoa, hey, listen," he stammered, his tough guy growl completely gone, replaced by a high, reedy whine. It was an accident. Seriously. I tripped. It was a misunderstanding. I took a deliberate step toward him, and he flinched. I let the silence hang for a beat, letting him stew in it. "A misunderstanding," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerously low temperature. "Let's be clear, Officer Miller. You profiled me the second I walked in. You used your uniform to intimidate me when I tried to order a coffee. You verbally threatened me, and then you committed assault. There is no misunderstanding here. There is only a sequence of events, and I promise you, I have a perfect memory." His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, an ally. He found none. The other patrons were now all staring, their phones subtly angled in our direction. He was no longer the town hero. He was the villain in a story that was going viral by the second. I pulled out my service phone, my movements precise and economical. I ignored his sputtering attempts to apologize. "Please, Agent, listen. I'm sorry, okay? I'm so sorry. I've been on a double shift. I'm not myself. My thumb unlocked the screen. You should have thought of that before you decided your uniform gave you the right to assault a citizen, I said without looking at him. I hit a number on my speed dial. It was answered on the first ring. Director, I said, my voice all business. The word alone made Miller visibly shrink. Agent Thorne, I need to report a Code 8. Assault on a federal officer by a local LEO. Yes, sir. In Maple Creek. I glanced at Miller's name tag again. Officer, David Miller. I've secured the scene. The officer is contained. Miller looked like he was going to be sick. Code 8 was an internal alert for an officer in trouble, or in this case, an incident involving an officer. It guaranteed an immediate, high-level response. Yes, sir. I'll need the OPR liaison to meet me here, I continued into the phone, and have them coordinate with the state police. I want this officer's weapon, vehicle, and locker secured immediately. The Office of Professional Responsibility, the FBI's internal affairs. For a local cop, having them show up was like having the Grim Reaper knock on your door. Miller's pathetic apologies turned into frantic, desperate pleading. Please, man, don't do this. I have a wife, kids. I'll lose my job. I'll lose everything. It was just a coffee. I'll buy you a new shirt. I ended the call and turned my full attention back to him. The rage was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but it was channeled, focused. You're right, I said softly. It was just a coffee. But it wasn't about the coffee, was it, Officer Miller? It was about power. It was about you seeing someone you didn't think belonged, someone you thought you could push around, and putting them in their place. You just picked the wrong person. I looked over at the terrified barista. Chloe, I said, my tone softening completely. I apologize for this disruption. I'm going to need a formal statement from you about what you witnessed, and I'm officially requesting you preserve all security footage from this establishment. Do you understand? She nodded numbly, unable to speak. Then, I turned back to Miller. His face was a mask of pure terror. He knew his career was over. He knew his life had been irrevocably changed, but he had no idea how much worse it was about to get. Officer Miller, I commanded, my voice like steel. Place your hands, palms down, on that counter. Interlock your fingers. Do it now. He hesitated for a split second, the last vestiges of his broken authority warring with the primal instinct for self-preservation. My stare broke him. He stumbled forward and shakily placed his hands on the sticky countertop, next to a display of biscotti. He was no longer a cop. He was a suspect. I leaned in, close enough that he could feel the radiating heat from my coffee-soaked shirt. My last case, the one that left me so tired I just wanted a simple cup of coffee, I whispered, my voice a venomous hiss, meant only for him. It involved a ring of corrupt cops who thought they were above the law. They started small, too, little abuses of power, intimidating people they thought wouldn't fight back, thinking their badge made them untouchable. So you're going to keep your hands right there, and you're going to pray. You're going to pray that when the OPR and the state police start digging into every traffic stop you've ever made, every arrest report you've ever filed, and every dollar you've ever deposited, that this little misunderstanding over a cup of coffee is the only thing they find. The next hour was a blur of controlled, efficient chaos. The sleepy little coffee shop transformed into a federal crime scene. 2 unmarked sedans, the kind that blend in everywhere and nowhere, materialized at the curb, followed swiftly by a crisply marked state police cruiser. The air, once filled with the scent of cinnamon and roasted beans, now carried the sharp, sterile tang of official business. My colleagues from the nearest field office arrived first. Agent Sullivan, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with eyes that missed nothing, took one look at my soaked shirt, and her expression hardened. She didn't need the story. She saw it. She quietly handed me a fresh tactical polo from her go-bag, while another agent, a young guy named Evans, started taking preliminary statements from the wide-eyed patrons. Officer Miller remained frozen, his hands still pressed against the sticky countertop as if glued there. The swagger was gone, replaced by a trembling, pathetic shell of a man. Every time a new official walked in, he flinched. He looked like a cornered animal, and in a way, he was. The state troopers arrived and, with a chilling lack of ceremony, disarmed him. The click of his sidearm being unholstered and secured in an evidence bag was deafening in the suddenly quiet room. They didn't cuff him. Not yet. They just stood near him. Two stoic, imposing figures who made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. I gave my own statement to Sullivan, sticking to the facts. My voice a cold monotone. The initial confrontation, the verbal threat, the assault. I described his words, his tone, the look in his eyes. Every detail was a nail being hammered into the coffin of his career. As I spoke, I watched the OPR liaison, a stern-faced man named Peterson, arrive. He was the kind of guy who looked like he was born wearing a suit and a frown. He didn't even acknowledge me at first, his entire focus lasering in on Miller. Peterson circled him slowly, like a shark sizing up its prey. "Officer David Miller?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Miller nodded meekly, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Yes, sir. You are being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending an internal investigation by your department and a civil rights investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Peterson stated. "You will surrender your badge and any other police credentials. You are not to contact any witnesses, including the barista, Chloe. You will not access any police databases or files. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. I had changed into the fresh polo shirt, the scorched skin on my chest a dull, angry red. The physical pain was nothing compared to the cold satisfaction I felt watching the gears of justice begin to turn. This wasn't just about a thrown coffee anymore. My whispered words to Miller hadn't been an empty threat. When a local cop assaults a federal agent, every rock in his life gets turned over. My call had triggered a protocol. While Peterson was reading Miller the Riot Act, I knew that back at the field office, analysts were already pulling every file associated with his name. Sullivan came over to me, holding a tablet. "Marcus," she said quietly, "we're running his service record. Preliminary flag just came up. You were right to tell them to dig?" My head snapped up. "What is it?" "A few excessive force complaints," she said, scrolling. "All of them dismissed internally. The complainants all fit a certain profile. Young men of color, mostly. Nothing ever stuck. The chief of police here, a guy named Henderson, signed off on every dismissal." A cold knot formed in my stomach. This was bigger than Miller. This was a pattern. This was a culture. "Get Henderson on the phone," I said. "I want to talk to him." A few minutes later, a state trooper handed me a phone. "Chief Henderson on the line for you, Agent Thorne." "Henderson," a gruff voice barked on the other end. "What the hell is going on in my town? I've got state police swarming the daily grind and one of my best officers being detained. I expect an explanation, Agent." The arrogance in his voice was chillingly familiar. "Chief Henderson," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "This is Special Agent Thorne. Your best officer just committed felony assault on a federal agent. Right now my only decision is whether we charge him at the state or federal level. So I suggest you adjust your tone." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the calculation, the damage control. "Listen," he finally said, his voice now slick with forced diplomacy. "Dave Miller can be a hothead, I know that. But he's a good cop. I'm sure this is all a terrible misunderstanding. Whatever he did, I'm sure he's sorry. Let's not blow this out of proportion. We can handle this internally." "That's no longer an option," I said flatly. "Your internal handling of past complaints against Officer Miller is precisely why we're here. We've already flagged several excessive force allegations that you personally dismissed." The line went silent again. This time it was a heavier, more panicked silence. "I'm on my way down there now," he said, his voice strained. "Don't do anything until I get there. We can sort this out." He hung up before I could reply. I handed the phone back to the trooper. A sense of unease washed over me. It wasn't just the chief's defensive tone. It was his desperation. He wasn't just trying to protect his officer. He was trying to protect himself. He was coming to the scene. He was abandoning the safety of his office to try and control the narrative in person. It was a mistake. A big one. 20 minutes later, A black SUV pulled up haphazardly, double parking in front of the coffee shop. A man in his late 50s with a florid face and a police chief's uniform bursting at the seams stormed out of the driver's side. This was Chief Henderson. He strode into the shop like he owned it, his eyes scanning the scene until they landed on me. He marched right up to me, his face a mask of indignation. "Agent Thorne," he boomed, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority. "I am Chief Henderson. This has gone on long enough. I'm here to take custody of my officer." Before I could even respond, something else caught my eye. As Henderson got closer, I saw it. A dark, ugly stain on the cuff of his otherwise pristine white uniform shirt. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but I had spent the last 72 hours looking at evidence from my human trafficking case. I knew exactly what I was seeing. It wasn't coffee. It was a smear of dried blood. And next to the bloodstain, almost invisible against the white fabric, were 2 long strands of distinctive, bright red hair. The exact same shade as the hair of the 17-year-old girl we had just rescued. The one victim whose trafficker had mysteriously gotten away. The world seemed to slow down. The hum of the espresso machine, the quiet murmuring of the agents, the distant wail of a siren, it all faded into a dull roar. My focus narrowed to that tiny, damning piece of evidence on Chief Henderson's cuff. The bloodstain, the 2 red hairs. It was impossible, a coincidence of the highest order. But in my line of work I had long since stopped believing in coincidences. My mind raced, connecting disparate points of data with lightning speed. The human trafficking case we'd just closed. The one trafficker who'd slipped through our net. The one we codenamed The Ghost because he was so adept at disappearing. The victim, a 17-year-old girl named Sarah with fiery red hair, had described him as a middle-aged man with a position of authority, someone who moved with confidence, someone people instinctively trusted. Maple Creek was 100 miles from our primary bus location, but it was on a direct route to the Canadian border, a known escape route. Officer Miller's absurdly aggressive behavior, was it just ego, or was he creating a diversion? Trying to get me, an unknown variable, out of his town as quickly as possible. And now the chief himself, storming in, not to de-escalate, but to control, to take custody, to make the problem go away, with what looked like evidence from my active case, literally on his sleeve. My voice, when I spoke, was deceptively calm. "Chief Henderson," I said, my eyes locked on his. I made no move to acknowledge the stain. Not yet. "You're right. You should take custody of your officer." Henderson puffed out his chest, a flicker of victory in his eyes. He thought he'd won. He thought his blustering display of authority had worked. He motioned to the state troopers. "All right, let's go, Dave. We'll get this sorted." But I held up a hand, stopping him. "On one condition," I said. "You come with us. We have a few questions for you as well, regarding your department's procedures." A flash of panic crossed his face, quickly masked by outrage. "That's ridiculous. I'm not being questioned." "It's not a request," I said, my tone hardening. I gave Agent Sullivan a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. She understood immediately. Her hand moved casually toward her hip. "Chief," I continued, taking a small step closer to him, creating a triangle between him, me, and Sullivan. "My last case was a multi-state human trafficking investigation. One of our key suspects, a real piece of work, managed to evade capture. Our victim described him as a man in his 50s, someone who used a position of authority to gain trust. Someone who, she thinks, might have been a cop." Henderson's face went from ruddy to ashen. He knew. He knew I wasn't guessing. He glanced at Miller, whose own face had contorted into a mask of pure terror. Miller wasn't just a dirty cop who profiled people. He was the lookout. He was the one who ran interference, who made problems disappear, who created loud public scenes to distract from quiet, private horrors. The coffee incident hadn't been a random act of bigotry. It had been a calculated, if clumsy, attempt to get rid of an unknown element me who was lingering in their town for too long. "That has nothing to do with me," Henderson blustered. But his voice lacked conviction. He subconsciously took a step back, his eyes darting toward the door. "Doesn't it?" I asked softly. I pointed toward his cuff. That's a nasty stain you've got there, Chief. Looks like blood. And is that red hair? We just rescued a girl with hair that exact color. She was held for 3 weeks in a basement, and she fought back. Scratched her attacker right before we found her. I'm sure a DNA test is just a formality. It was over. The color drained completely from Henderson's face. The tough, commanding police chief evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, guilty man. He made a sudden, desperate move, a lunge for the door. But he was old and slow, and my team was not. Before he'd taken 2 steps, Sullivan and Evans had him, arms twisted expertly behind his back, his face pressed against the glass of the pastry display. The clatter of his handcuffs locking into place echoed the ones that were finally being slapped on Officer Miller, who had started sobbing openly. The patrons in the coffee shop, who had stayed to watch the initial drama, were now witnessing the stunning downfall of their town's entire police leadership. Chloe, the young barista, just stared, her hand over her mouth. I walked over to her. "You were very brave," I said gently. "You'll be a key witness in all of this. We'll make sure you're protected." She just nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Later that day, after Henderson and Miller were securely in federal custody and the initial shock had worn off, Sullivan handed me a steaming cup of coffee in a fresh, clean paper cup. "From the barista," she said with a small smile. "On the house." I took a sip. It was black, hot, and perfect. The exhaustion I'd been feeling for days was still there, but it was different now. It was the good kind of tired. The kind that comes after a long, hard fight for justice has finally been won. We had closed our case. We had found our ghost. He wasn't some criminal mastermind. He was just another petty tyrant in a uniform who thought he was above the law. He thought a cup of coffee could wash away his sins, could assert his dominance and hide his crimes. But in the end, all it did was expose him. It brought the full weight of the Federal Bureau of Investigation down on his corrupt little world, all because he couldn't stand the sight of a tired black man in a hoodie just trying to get his day started. He had picked the wrong person to mess with, on the wrong day, in the wrong coffee shop, and in doing so, he'd given a 17-year-old girl named Sarah her life back. And that was a resolution that tasted even better than the coffee.